October 18th, 1973, Mansfield, Ohio. Often on this show, we talk about some unexplained phenomenon, most notably and perhaps most frequently, the existence of extraterrestrial life, and whether or not we are truly alone in the universe. As I publish this episode, the U.S. government is having another hearing on the existence of UAPs, otherwise known as Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, and as it gains more mainstream media coverage, it often circles us back to some of the most notorious of UFO encounters, one of which that we are discussing today. 4 United States Army Reserve officers were flying in a helicopter from Columbus, Ohio, en route for Cleveland. What they would see on that short flight would become one of the most credible UFO sightings recorded, and the most credible in a flurry of sightings that would take place around Mansfield and in the greater Ohio area in 1973. Today, on Unblurring the Unknown, the Coyne helicopter incident. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and as you will be listening to this episode, it'll be past Thanksgiving, so I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. Of course, I took last week off for the holiday, so it's kind of been that extra week of not talking to you, and I hope that you all have missed me as much as I have missed you. Now, today on the show, we are back in the realm of aliens and UFOs, and it has been quite some time since we had talked about UFOs and such, and I felt like with the recent news of the government hearings over UAPs, that it was the perfect time to switch course and talk about alien encounters and UFOs, for at least this week, that is. So for this week's episode, we're going over an encounter I know very little about, and I actually hadn't heard about until I did my research into it for this week. Now, before we dive into the story, I think it's important we go over a little bit of the UFO phenomenon and what it was like during the 1970s, and leading up to the 1970s. After all, the men who witnessed a strange craft in the sky over Mansfield, Ohio, were all US Reserve Servicemen, and even one of them was a police officer for his regular 9-to-5 job. Now, these are all credible people who even added to the complexity of this UFO mystery that was kind of going on at the time, and this idea that the government wasn't fully sold on the idea that UFOs existed, and I want to give you, like I said, a little bit of background into kind of UFOs and kind of the government's stance on them leading up to this time period. The United States government first got involved with investigating UFOs all the way back in the late 1940s, when mounting sightings caused the United States to investigate. In 1947, private pilot and established businessman Kenneth Arnold would have a monumental sighting around Mount Rainier in Washington state when looking for a downed aircraft. Now, what Kenneth Arnold would describe, he would say that he would see 9 disc-shaped objects that he could only describe as flying saucers. Now, that's kind of where the term came from, and perhaps that I will cover Kenneth Arnold's sighting on a later episode. Now, subsequent sightings would cause the U.S. government to take the threat of flying saucers and UFOs as a serious possible threat to American lives and national security, and thus multiple investigations were launched to determine the legitimacy of these sightings. Now, fast forward to the 1960s, the American government was still investigating these sightings, and at one point in their collected research, they determined that 90% of these sightings that were all pulled in and given to the United States government, and these kind of collections of sightings were reported to a variety of projects, most notably being Project Blue Book. Now, most of these, that 90% that is, were easily explainable as a regular phenomenon and not extraterrestrial in nature. However, 10% of those sightings could not be accounted for or explained. Now, I could honestly do a whole episode on Project Blue Book and the projects that preceded Project Blue Book, and everything that those projects did over their years in operation, and to be honest with you, I most likely will at a later time. Now, with the publishing of the infamous Condon Report in 1969, which, if you are unfamiliar with the Condon Report, let me give you a little background into it, was a report that was published by the Condon Committee that was assembled to investigate these reports of UFOs, and in conclusion, this Condon Report reported that, and I quote, "Our general conclusion is that nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record as it is available to us leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced thereby." Now, this statement, in and of itself, was kind of a blow to the UFO community and the researchers who were adamant that the government should look more into this. They should not give up. They should keep looking into this. They should not just say, hey, we can't justify doing all this research. We can't. Case closed. So people were kind of upset about that, and rightfully so. Now, kind of the obscurity of the final statement and the fact that the Condon report didn't conclude or disprove anything, rather than just kind of push it to the back burner and kind of cloud this whole idea of UFOs, and now, as we talk about them in present day, UAPs, in kind of this cloud of smoke. Like, hey, we can't really prove anything, but we don't want to investigate them either. That was pretty much it. Now, even though there are more incidents and sightings that took place after the Condon reports publishing in January of 1969, and even after Project Blue Book's closing in December of that same year, reports and sightings continued to come in, while the U.S. distanced its interest from the UFO phenomenon entirely. Now, of course, that is a very summarized little history breakdown for you. And I know I probably glazed over some stuff, and I'm fairly certain I will do a Project Blue Book episode, and even cover the Condon report in more detail in later episodes as well. I just wanted to give you a little history lesson and a little background to provide some context before the Coyne helicopter incident takes place. Now, fast forward to the fall of 1973. Ohio, particularly central and southwest Ohio, where the Coyne helicopter incident would take place later on. Now, this area was flooded with reports of unexplained lights in the sky and sightings of UFOs, and I will actually get into some of those after I go over the main story here. Now, not only this, you also have in the same year, you have the incident that occurred in Pascagoula, Mississippi, where two men claimed to be abducted by aliens, and if you do not know, I've actually covered this in a previous episode, and if you want to hear it, I highly suggest you go and check it out. But also during the same year, you had the Ohio governor, John Gilligan, claiming to see a UFO with his wife while traveling through Ann Arbor, Michigan, around, again, same time, 1973, in kind of the same area of when the Coyne helicopter incident would take place, kind of in this October, late fall time frame. So, needless to say, this was a very hot topic and a very frequent occurrence in the Ohio area, but also in the United States in general. And of course, with the government's involvement in years prior, the idea of UFOs was something that was, I shouldn't say common knowledge, but it was certainly talked about at a rate that probably it had not been talked about before. Now, again, what makes the Coyne helicopter incident perhaps the most credible of all the sightings that took place in and around Ohio during this time was the supposed witnesses of this UFO and during this encounter, all being US Army Reserve officers. Now, on October 18th, 1973, at around 10:30 p.m., a UH-1H Super Huey helicopter left Port Columbus Airport en route for Cleveland Hopkins Airport, 96 miles away. On board this helicopter were 4 U.S. Army Reserve service members. In the right front seat sat Captain Lawrence Coyne, who was 36 at the time of the incident and had 19 years of flying experience. At the controls of the helicopter was First Lieutenant Arrigo Jezzi, a 26-year-old chemical engineer. And in the backseat of the aircraft was Sergeant John Healy, 35, a policeman from Cleveland, and also the designated flight medic. And then lastly, Sergeant Robert Yanisek, who was 23, who was a computer technician. Now, the 4 men were returning to Cleveland after flying to Columbus for their regularly scheduled flight physical at approximately 10 p.m., and they were then returning home. Sergeant Healy noted after the flight, and others had corroborated this as well, that all 4 men were sober and in good health, which adds to the validity of this story that they go on to tell. It was a cloudless and otherwise peaceful fall night with nothing out of the ordinary to speak of, and during the flight they were cruising at roughly 2,500 feet off the ground and flying at approximately 103 miles per hour. Shortly after 11 p.m., while flying over the Charles Mill Lake area near Mansfield, Ohio, Sergeant Yanisek noticed a single bright red light off in the distance to the east of the helicopter. Now, the men at this point originally assumed that this was either another aircraft or perhaps a cell phone tower or the wing of a much larger aircraft. However, that wasn't the case. The red light then turned and switched direction and started making its way towards the helicopter. Captain Coyne would radio the station in Mansfield to see if there was any aircraft operating in the area, and what they got back from this Mansfield Station, they kind of acknowledged their communication, and then the transmission cut out. Now, while this is going on, again, Coyne started descending the helicopter because he wasn't sure if this was an aircraft. He wasn't sure if this was some type of foreign object. He was kind of playing it safe. They descended the aircraft, and as he radioed to the Mansfield Station, the communication they got back from the National Guard station in Mansfield was simply, and I quote, "This is Mansfield Tower, go ahead, Army 15444," and then the transmission just cut out, and they could not contact them anymore. They lost all transmission, Almost like whatever that was rapidly approaching the helicopter, this bright red light, even though they had no idea what it was able to cut their lines of communication unexpectedly. And of course, the men at the time probably did not know that. Now, as this red light rapidly approached the men in the helicopter, the men tried evasive maneuvers to try and get out of the way of the approaching aircraft, and Coyne and the team rapidly descended the helicopter. However, this did not help, as the aircraft following Coyne continued to follow, and thought that he was actually going to collide with this object, that the helicopter was going to collide with this object, and the men kind of braced for impact at this point because they thought whatever this was going to collide straight into them. Now, like I said, at this point, the four men thought for sure whatever this aircraft or object was, that it was certainly going to make contact with the helicopter, crash into them, and Coyne remembered at this point hearing the voice of John Healy saying, "Look at that." And what the men then saw in front of them baffled them, as they couldn't fully process or understand what they were looking at. Now, it turns out that this object had stopped right in front of them, or right kind of over them. And all four of the men described the craft that stood still in front of their helicopter as roughly 60 feet long, cigar-shaped in nature, and mostly metallic gray in color. The red light that the men saw seemed to be focused at the front of the object, while there was a white light on the tail end of the craft, as well as a green light coming out of the bottom that kind of came out of the craft in a kind of cone or pyramid-like beam of light, similar to the cone created, by like a spotlight or something like that. And this green light had actually shined throughout the cabin of the helicopter and illuminated pretty much the entire helicopter. Now, what happened next would just add to the perplexing experience the men had that night. While in this green beam of light, the men tried to use their radio and compass, and both were not working. They could not place any calls to help whatsoever, and while surveying kind of the situation they were in, Captain Coyne realized that during this encounter that the cigar-shaped object was actually pulling the helicopter upwards, 3,500 feet upwards to be exact, for approximately 10 seconds. Now, at this point, you can imagine what the four decorated military men were thinking as this kind of thing, for lack of a better word, seemingly pulled you 3,500 feet upwards without you realizing. It would probably be equal parts fear and shock. Now, during this, as the mysterious craft kind of pulled the helicopter upwards, it stopped. And it was seemingly done with whatever inspection or whatever it was doing with the men in the helicopter. And, like I said, it stopped pulling them upwards, and then slowly turned away and sped off to the west towards Lake Erie. Now, Coyne, Yanisek, and Healy estimated it moved at upwards of 600 knots per second, whereas Jesse thought the craft moved a little slower than that. Now, this 600 knots per second greatly exceeds the speed limit in place for aircraft flying below 10,000 feet, which would only be 250 knots. So this object would not be flying by conventional law, which makes me think, of course, and I have to imagine this would make the men think as well, that this was not a military or civilian aircraft. Now, the helicopter crew then continued the rest of their trip towards Cleveland, and were unable to determine what they encountered that night. After the event, it was discovered that the compass was shot completely, and that the flight crew couldn't even repair it, and they had to buy an entire new unit and install it. That, of course, can be corroborated in other UFO encounters, where witnesses say that these unexplained craft have some type of electromagnetic influence that can disable things like radios, compasses, and other types of navigation equipment, and even cell phones. Coyne will also go on to contact the Mansfield National Guard Tower, that same guard tower he tried to get in touch with on the night of the incident, and when he inquired about recordings and or contact with the helicopter crew that night, the Mansfield Tower said they had no recordings or any documentation saying that they had talked to the men that night. which checks out, as Coyne obviously lost the signal to talk to the tower that night. Now, that same night, when back at Cleveland Hopkins Airport, Coyne would visit P.J. Vollmer, the chief of operations for the FAA at Cleveland Hopkins Airport. Coyne would go on to tell this story to P.J. Vollmer, in which P.J. later recalls had no reason not to believe Coyne and what the men saw that night. Vollmer would go on to later state, and I quote, "I personally have an extremely high regard for his integrity and capability." He continues and says, "In a case of this kind, I don't know anybody that I would believe anymore." He continues again and says, "I trust his judgment without a question of a doubt. I don't know what happened, but I do know. I could tell from the tremor of his voice, which wasn't much, that he was shook." Now, after the events of that night on October 18th, 1973, Coyne and the others would go on to tell this story about what happened to them that night. Now, Coyne would actually tell this story to his cousin, who was a reporter for the Plain Dealer. Now, Coyne would also go on to talk to Rod Sterling, the creator of The Twilight Zone, to perhaps make a documentary about the encounter, and he even talked to talk show host Dick Cavett, and perhaps the most compelling spot to tell a story I've ever heard, the United Nations. Now, in 1978, Lawrence Coyne would testify in front of the United Nations about his and the flight crew's experience that night, with him quoted by saying, "I am convinced this object was real, and that these type of incident require a thorough investigation and advocating an international effort to maintain order for flyers who might have similar encounters." Now, the flight crew would later go on to be awarded the National Enquirer Blue Ribbon Panel's Most Scientifically Valuable Report of 1973 and be rewarded $5,000. Now, obviously, that's kind of a nice little payday on the surface of it, but in doing my research for this episode, I discovered a variety of things. One of which being that this area of the United States is no stranger to UFO sightings whatsoever. In March of 1978, witness Olive Owen reported seeing a very strange light in the sky that was traveling in a very unusual and perplexing pattern near Possum Run Road in Mansfield. Then fast forward all the way to 2004. March 11th, 2004. Two Ontario, Canada residents would have an encounter near Columbus where they described a triangular-shaped craft with multiple yellow lights on it, traveling at only 50 miles per hour or so along Route 309. Lastly, on June 6th of 2018, a chevron-shaped object was observed to be flying over Mansfield, reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. The witnesses of this chevron-shaped craft said that it was flying between the altitudes of 10,000 to 5,000 feet. Now, of course, this doesn't even cover the rest of the sightings that also took place in 1973 that seemed to culminate with the Coyne incident. Now, I want to go over these sightings in 1973. I know that they are a little off topic from the overall Coyne helicopter incident, but it kind of goes on to show that there was a lot of activity in this concentrated area. And, of course, I will go into theories about why that possibly could be, but for the time being, let me go into some of these sightings. Now, starting back on September 23rd and September 24th in 1973 in nearby Fort Wayne, Indiana, a woman heading to the grocery store sees an object up in the sky that she describes as looking like an ocean liner with 5 rows of flashing yellow lights. The next night, the 24th, 2 policemen see an unexplained object moving across the night sky. They got in touch with the nearby airfield to see if they could try and identify the craft in question. However, the airfield said that they too saw the unidentified aircraft, but were not able to figure out what it was. Then, on September 30th in Columbus, Ohio, a man in Franklin County came out and stated that he thought he had discovered a landing site of a UFO after witnessing a strange craft in the sky that he stated, and I quote, swooped down in a zigzag pattern and dropped below the trees. And when he went to investigate the area, he discovered an impression left behind in the ground in a, and I quote, semi-oval area 20 by 30 feet wide. Now, that same night, dozens of other witnesses also reported seeing strange things in the sky. Then, in neighboring Indiana and Illinois on October 5th, 1973, at around 3 a.m. that night, a woman in Ziegler, Illinois, got up in the middle of the night and went to see if she had left her hallway light on because there was a whole bunch of light coming into her house. She's like, "Oh, I must have left the hallway light on by accident." And when she got up, she actually observed an extremely bright light emitting from the back of her residence. Now, she would observe an object emitting this bright light, this kind of large object that was just beaming with light. And the following morning, she actually started to have trouble with her vision, almost like this bright light from the object was so bright that it could actually damage human eyesight. Then at 6:15 p.m. that same day, a woman in Laurel, Indiana, stated that she saw a, and I quote, house-sized object in the sky that had pale gray lines on it that almost made it look like it was in 3 sections. Now, she observed this object in the sky for roughly 3 minutes. An hour later, at 7:15 p.m., police in nearby Connorsville, Indiana, near the Ohio border, received over 100 phone calls about witnesses seeing strange lights in the sky. Calls mainly consisted of quotes of, and I quote, unknown shape with red and white lights, hovered, jumped, and made fantastic low-altitude passes over the city. Then, another hour later, at 8:15 p.m. in Waterloo, Indiana, witnesses reported seeing a giant mushroom-like object sitting stationary in the sky. It was witnessed to have red lights flashing at the top of the object, while a set of what looked to be long gold-colored ropes hung out from underneath the craft. My first kind of reaction to hearing this story was space jellyfish. And I don't know if that is true or if it is a space jellyfish, but regardless, that's pretty cool. I've never heard of a UFO being described as a giant mushroom with ropes coming out of it, but I can kind of see the image in space jellyfish. And then fast forward to October 7th in Middletown, Ohio. Witnesses reported seeing a giant cigar-shaped object with orange lights emitting from it, flying over the city at approximately 10 p.m. Nearby Wright-Patterson Air Base was flooded with calls from onlookers looking for answers as to what they were seeing in the sky. Now, again in Fort Wayne, and then this time in Eaton, Indiana, on October 9th, witnesses state seeing an object hovering over a canning factory and moving in a counterclockwise motion. Military radar in Fort Wayne seemingly picks up either this strange object or perhaps a different one on radar, but they are unable to determine what it is, and local police receive approximately 200 calls related to unidentified objects in the sky over Fort Wayne and Eaton, Indiana. Then in Dayton, Ohio, on October 11th, around 15 reports of unexplained objects in the sky are reported to local authorities. Many witnesses reported these objects with red, green, and blue lights, and most of them being very low to the ground and actually hovering above the treetops. A local sheriff's deputy also reported seeing something strange. He reported seeing an oblong object, I can't pronounce today, I apologize, and I quote, and this is what he said, appeared stationary in the sky at treetop level for several minutes. Then the sheriff's deputy shined his flashlight on it, and then it, and I quote, zoomed towards him and then shot up straight in the sky. Now in Troy, Ohio, on the same day, October 11th, Troy Police Patrolman Early Thomas and around 100 Troy residents reported seeing a red, green, and white object move across the sky towards the southwest. About 15 minutes later, neighboring counties in which the object was seen headed towards got reports of hearing a loud sonic boom-like noise. Hundreds of phone calls were received by local authorities, and even more were heard after a second sonic boom was heard after midnight. Then in Boston, Ohio, on October 14th, a woman reportedly approached police officers in the town of Boston, claiming that a large oblong object with blinking lights landed in her field at her farm, and that it actually ended up killing several of her cows. Now, on this same night, on October 14th, in the towns of London, Chillicothe, and Greenfield, a school bus driver had a sighting of a strange orange-colored object hovering above some trees. Then in Chillicothe, motorists had sightings of luminous craft and police officers. Then in Greenfield also saw something in which they followed a huge object for 5 miles. Then on Cincinnati, Ohio, on October 17th, the local sheriff's office received roughly 30 to 40 calls about objects zigzagging across the sky near Cincinnati. A police sergeant even said that he pursued one of these objects that was white and yellow in color. A family also reported seeing an object half the size of a football field fly over their home in Hamilton, Ohio, that same night while it made no noise. Then on October 18th would be the Coyne incident. That kind of seems like when this event would kind of culminate and then plateau. The area, of course, still sees UFO sightings, like I mentioned earlier, but these rash of sightings is worth noting. And that is why, again, I decided to list these all out for you. Now, of course, with all of those facts mentioned and all of these kind of sightings listed out about the fall of 1973 in this kind of greater Ohio region, and of course, the Coyne helicopter incident itself, let's go into some possible theories about what the men could have witnessed that night, and perhaps about what the object was that they actually saw in the night sky that evening. Now, my first theory here is that, of course, if this is real, what the men saw that night was in fact a genuine UFO, and they had no reason to lie about it because they were trustworthy individuals, all with careers and serving with the Army Reserves. Again, that pitch right there sounds a little bit too perfect, but on the surface, they wouldn't have any reason to lie about some strange experience they went on to have, and of course, they did go on to find outlets to tell the story because they wanted more people to be aware of the UFO phenomenon in the controversy and heated debates around it during this time period. Coyne went on to tell his story at the UN, of course, in various other places, and a lot of people took his word for it, which is honestly really hard to find in a UFO case where people across the board believe that an individual who had a sighting or who had an encounter were telling the truth about what happened. Of course, I mentioned what happened in Pascagoula, Mississippi this same year, 1973. And nobody really believed those men. Some people did, because they knew who they were and they thought they were trustworthy. But for a variety of people who heard that story of the Pascagoula incident, they did not believe those men. And in a lot of UFO cases that I've covered, there's been a lot of skepticism around them. This is one incident in particular where I feel like people look at it and say, okay, these are 4 US Army service members. They encountered something. I think what they saw was genuine. And this seems to be the resounding feedback from everything that I researched into this case, which is very surprising to me and very shocking considering the amount of UFO cases that I've looked into. And of course, the amount that I've looked into is only scratching the surface of total UFO encounters, of course. Now, the second theory I have is probably maybe another no-brainer, and that this is fake. Now, this theory, of course, would be that whatever the men saw that night must have been something else. Perhaps another military aircraft that stopped over them and tried to communicate and had trouble doing so. However, to me, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense in my eyes, and I really can't think of anything that this could be. Now, a little knowledge nugget to kind of go along with this theory that maybe this was another military aircraft is that during 1973, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base had a lot of aircraft coming and going from it due to rising World War tensions, or worldwide tensions, I should say, with kind of the Cold War going on, and then obviously the rising threat of a possible nuclear war. Now, the U.S. Army was very active out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and perhaps that could be responsible for some of the lights that people saw in the skies around Ohio in 1973. However, the Coyne helicopter incident, in my eyes, I can't really see anything that points to the men thinking that this was fake. Now, on the surface, again, and I'll kind of jump back on this here. In my eyes, this stands alone as something that I truly have no idea what this could be, other than some type of genuine UFO craft, because honestly, what would have the capability to wipe out their communications and radar just like, a snap of their fingers, and then be able to pull the helicopter an additional 3,500 feet up in the air? It just doesn't make any sense. But again, do I think that maybe some of the sightings in the greater Ohio area in 1973 were results of military aircraft that were unidentified? People were just looking up in the sky and perhaps seeing a light pattern that they weren't super familiar with and just calling it in and saying, hey, there's some unexplained lights in the sky. It's got to be a UFO, when in reality it could be a military aircraft maybe running a drill or doing a variety of other things. Now, that very well could be a possibility for some of these strange lights in the sky. However, to backtrack on the idea that this is real, the only really theory that I can pull out of this, and this is me being a skeptic, of course, is the idea that the men made it up. That they had heard about all the encounters of lights in the sky and people seeing things that they can't explain, and they said, hey, why don't we frame a story? We make up a story. And people are going to believe us because we're U.S. Army service members and we got nothing to lie. On the surface, we got nothing to lie about, and we're trustworthy people now. We're sober, and we'll have them do all this other stuff, and we'll just create the story and we'll all stick to it in the effort to get some type of public publicity out of it. Now, of course, they did get financial incentives. Obviously, Lawrence Coyne talked to the creator of the Twilight Zone to try and make a documentary. I don't know if that ever happened or not, but obviously he had talked to the talk show host, Dick Cavett, and talked to the UN, and they got $5,000 from the National Enquirer. And even though a lot of those things in other UFO cases would stick out to me like smoking guns in terms of, okay, this is made up, this is not real, they're doing it for financial incentives, and whenever book deals, movies, money, anything like that gets involved in any one of these cases, in my eyes, it ruins a lot of the validity. But I don't think that's the case here. In my eyes, it looks like all four men were sober. They were shook to the core about what they saw that night, and they wanted to make sure that people knew about it and that these objects were out there and that they exist. Now, in my eyes, again, I think that's 110% what happened. Now, you are fully willing to disagree with me, and you can go down to the comments, leave your own personal thoughts and theories about what could have happened to the crew on board that helicopter where the Coyne helicopter incident took place. But this was a fun one for me to research, fun one for me to look into, and of course with the UAP hearings going on in just, a few weeks ago. And spoiler alert, that's actually going to be my next episode after this one. I'll be going into that hearing and obviously the findings of it, and then going over the kind of big project that's been thrown out there, Immaculate Constellation. That will be the next episode. So again, that's a little teaser for you for the next week. I'll be looking into that, looking into the results of that UAP hearing and everything that was brought out by the whistleblower that came forward and described the results of the project known as Immaculate Constellation. Now, like I said, that's probably going to do it today for me. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving, had a great time with your families, and had a wonderful holiday. Well, that being said, if you were listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you were listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. Helps me out with the algorithm gods. If you get me in the algorithm, I greatly appreciate it. And it goes without saying, again, thank you, thank you, thank you. With that being said, I am also on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, where I post videos on there. Trying to be more active with it now that I have a personal studio all to myself. Trying to be a little bit more active on there, but sometimes other things in my life prevail over TikTok. But again, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode. Again, feel free to also send me topic suggestions. I have a running list now of topic ideas, and I have done topic suggestions in the past. Usually in the episode, I will state that this was a topic suggestion of some sort. It's living proof that I do them, so send them to my email at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I'll say that again, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can also Instagram direct message them to me, leave them in the comments, whatever you want to do. If you want me to cover an episode, send it on over to me, and I'm usually very, very good about doing your topic suggestions. So send them over to me. With that being said, again, that's going to do it for this episode on the Coyne helicopter incident. Hope you all enjoyed it again. This was a cool one, and I am glad to be covering UFOs again. So a very good change of pace from kind of the true crime kind of murder attitude I've been on in recent weeks. So again, that is going to do it from me, and I will see you all on the next one.